Lucas, international security expert, who's a columnist for The Times and also a Lib Dem candidate at the next election for the cities of London and Westminster. Lots of ways you can ask your question, preferably by phone, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can use Alexa. Just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and you can send in your question that way. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player. Why wouldn't you?
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Alex in Bognor Regis. Alex, hello. What would you like to ask?
Oh, hello. Good evening. My question is basically very simple. Why aren't asylum seekers processed in the first country that they arrive in?
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? If it was simple, I guess we'd have had the answer by now, but we haven't. Anna Firth, let's come to you first on that.
Thank you, Alex. Very good question. And the simple answer, Alex, is because there is now a multi-million pound business in smuggling people across continents and putting them into small boats and smuggling them across the English Channel. And, you know, that's the tragedy that we've all seen on our television screens today. And that's exactly why the Prime Minister has made this a personal mission of his to crack down on these smuggling gangs and to try and tackle illegal immigration. And you know, one of the only way in which we are going to stop these horrendous events happening is if we do have a robust system that deters people from making that dangerous crossing by knowing that if they do make that crossing and then they do arrive on our shores, they will be intercepted by the new small boats Operation Command, and then as soon as they do arrive on our shores, they should be processed, and then after being processed, they should be returned to the country that they've come from. And if they've come from Albania, we have a new agreement with Albania, and that will be over a quarter of people coming at the moment in these small boats are coming from Albania. They will be repatriated back to Albania and or to their own country, or if that's not safe, they will go to Rwanda and be processed there. And it's only if we take these tough steps that we are going to stop these tragedies happening on a daily, on a monthly basis.
If your party had only been in power for the last 6 months or a year, a lot of that would be true, but of course the Conservatives have been in power in one form or another since 2010, and the small boat crossings have been a real issue for at least the last two and a half years. Yes, measures have been announced this week, but they're mainly sort of medium to long-term measures. They're not actually going to do anything to solve the problem right now. We've had 4 people die today, 27 people died in November 2021. People are going to start asking, what will it take for some immediate action to be taken to prevent more people dying?
No, well, you're absolutely right, Iain, but the small boats crossings have quadrupled in the last 2 years. There used to be about 8,000 that came across the English Channel, and now this year alone it's over 40,000, which is why it's absolutely urgent that we do something about it. Now, my understanding is that the new agreement that we have with Albania will enable us to repatriate people. We have a returns agreement with Albania. That's something which we can do immediately. As soon as those people have been processed, they can...
But the Germans and the Swedes have been doing that for the last year. We're just too slow all the time, aren't we?
Well, much better late than never. And we've now, we've taken these, we're taking these tougher steps, and the sooner we get on with them, frankly, the better.
Edward Lucas.
First of all, these are people, they're not numbers. Secondly, you're absolutely right. The Conservatives have been in power for a certain amount of time, and it's odd they're only now getting to grips with it. Thirdly, my question is, where is the safe route for asylum? This was a question that was put to the Home Secretary, and she literally couldn't answer it. And if you people are so desperate they're willing to risk their lives and death by drowning, that suggests that there's enormous demand to come to this country because of things that we should cherish, the fact that it's safe and free and actually quite prosperous by world standards. And if people are in danger of their lives and want a asylum. There is literally, in most of the world, no safe way they can get there. It's all been shut down, and the result is this desperation.
What should be done in the short term?
I think Brexit has made it more difficult, because when we were still in the EU, you could actually send people back. There was this rather technical term called refoulement. I think that the first thing to do is to reopen safe routes to asylum. I think Albania is at the poorer end of the spectrum in Europe, and we can be doing a lot more to encourage Albania's prosperity in Albania. But in the end, we are facing an era of enormous migration. Climate change means this.
It's only going to get worse, isn't it?
Well, the problem's going to get bigger. Whether you say it gets worse depends on whether you hand it over to the people smugglers or actually try and manage it more sensibly.
James Murray from the Labour Party. Safe routes is something that Yvette Cooper has been talking about. Many Conservative MPs are starting to look down that road. Do you think that there is a hope now that the government might be investigating having maybe a reception centre in Calais where people can register? That might be something that could work.
I think the problem is that people don't trust the government to do anything to fix the broken system of immigration and asylum that we've got in this country. As you said, Iain, in your introduction, some of the excuses we hear from government might make sense if they'd been in government a few months. But after 12 years, when the government talk about there being a broken system, the obvious response to that is to say, well, you broke it. Or you presided over that broken system.
But the problem is people don't trust the Labour Party to mend it, and because they don't trust Labour on immigration either.
Well, look, I think people do trust the fact that we're setting out a plan for dealing with it, for getting down, making sure we're processing those cases rather than letting the accommodation bill rack up and people spend months and years in limbo. And we've set out how, rather than pursuing unworkable, unethical gimmicks like the Rwanda plan that the government have come up with, we would have spent that money on the National Crime Agency to tackle the criminal gangs at source. The government, it feels like when the government are talking about National Crime Agency, they're playing catch up. This is something we've been talking about. No, when we're talking about spending money on that to tackle the criminal gangs, which is something Yvette Cooper.
But they are already doing that.
We've been talking about for months how we need more money.
But they are doing that already.
We've been talking about how the money which the government were talking about investing have spent on the Rwanda scheme, that money should be better invested in the National Crime Agency to tackle these criminal gangs at source and to stop the people smuggling happening. And, it's all very well for Rishi Sunak or whoever to stand up in Parliament and announce these new plans and say, no, this time we're really going to fix it. This time we mean it. There's been 12 years.
James,
they've broken the system and they presided over that system.
James, why didn't you support the Nationality and Borders Act, which gave us the power to prosecute these illegal traffickers, and prosecutions have gone up 250% since we passed that? Why didn't you support that?
When that bill was going through Parliament, we were told at the time, look, this bill will fix all of the problems at source. This will tackle all of the issues which have led to our broken system. And here we are, back a year later, and it's still broken. And again, the government is announcing, oh, I'm sorry, we've just discovered there's a broken system. I just think people won't buy it. We've had so many prime ministers, we've had so many home secretaries, they all say the system's broken, and the British people are starting to say, well, actually, you've broken it and we don't trust you to fix it.
Actually, we've only had 2 home secretaries since the last election, unlike other cabinet ministers.
Over the last 12 years. That's the last 12 years.
No, that is true. Stanley.
This is the question we had was, why can't asylum seekers be processed in the first safe country they come in? Now, my recollection is that we had the Dublin Agreement, and I think the Dublin Agreement provided exactly that. And one of the problems, I know we're going to rewrite history now, but one of the problems about Brexit is that a lot of good things which we had, which made us able to work together with our European colleagues, have been demolished. I think we need to take this as an example of the way we have to lean out now to Europe, say, look, we're out, of course we're out. Nonetheless, we have to revisit some of the old arrangements we have. That's the first point I'd like to make. Second, on that...
Why would they want to play ball with us on this?
Because we are part of the same geopolitical area. That's why.
Yes, but what it means is that instead of people coming here, they would stay in EU countries, particularly France. There's no incentive for the French government to do that, is there?
I think if they don't want to cooperate with us on this, then of course it may well be that our people will start taking a slightly tougher line on it. And we at the moment are picking them up just as soon as they get out of French waters. Maybe we won't do that any longer. So these are the things which we're going to have to. And the third point, very very quickly, is actually the idea that the Albanians as a right of asylum. That's very difficult to understand, given that Albania is pretty much a safe country.
Edward, you wanted to come back.
Well, yeah, my actually ancestors came to this country not in a small boat, but hidden in fishing barrels, escaping religious persecution, and made a huge contribution to this country.
Were they Huguenots?
Yes, they were Huguenots.
I thought they were.
Until obviously,
so they were the Protestants coming out of France.
I was born, which probably lowered the tone a bit. But I think that the idea that you can just solve this with a sort of stroke of the bureaucratic pen is absurd. The backlog has grown up, is absolutely enormous, and there's no deterrent in the system. If you say, oh, we're going to process these people and then send them home, nobody believes that, because there's so many thousands and thousands of people who are just living in this ghastly limbo where they're not allowed to work, they're not allowed to contribute to this country, and they're not allowed to do any of the things that they actually wanted to do when they came here. Instead of which they're just sitting there and facing this so-called hostile environment in the hope that it's a deterrent. It doesn't. It just makes them miserable. Means that we don't get any of the benefits of migration and fails to deter anybody else from coming.
I mean, the three of you, I'm excluding Stanley from this, but the three of you go out on the doorstep, presumably every week, door knocking and talking to constituents or potential constituents, in your case, Edward. I keep being told by Conservative MPs that this is coming up all the time on the doorstep and it's going to be a really big issue at the next election. Can you three confirm or deny that, James?
It does come up a bit. I think people respond to it in lots of different ways, if I'm honest. I think some people are concerned about how long it's taking to process people's applications. They read the stories about people being stuck in hotels, get very worried about that and the cost of it. I think other people feel, are focused on the fact that the system they feel is not set up to follow the right values, the right principles. And I think other people, well, everyone to be honest, who does mention it, sees things like the horrific events we saw, people dying in the Channel, and just utterly shocked by it and utterly feel it's horrific. And we must do something to tackle that problem.
Your constituents are obviously very liberally minded. You don't get anybody saying these people shouldn't be allowed in. We're full up.
Well, no, I think people do. I think people do respond and say, well, actually, we need a fair immigration system. People do say that. I have a brilliant constituency that has a range of different opinions in it.
Sure.
But it's great. You do. This is one reason why all politicians should go door knocking as often as possible.
Anna.
If I can just finish. Sorry, I just want to finish on this point because there is a definite opinion that comes up from my constituents saying we want a fair system. We want a fair system that we can trust in to make fair and speedy decisions, and that is what they feel they're not getting.
Anna.
Yeah. No, I mean, representing Southend, absolutely it comes up as an issue because people are aware of the enormous pressure on our public services and the increase in population that we've had, and people see very clearly that we cannot take everybody. But just as people are very concerned about illegal immigration, people are actually proud of the legal routes that have been developed, so such as Homes for Ukraine, such as the Afghan resettlement scheme also for people coming from Hong Kong. I mean, the fact that this allegation that there are no safe and legal routes is actually not true. We've actually accepted 300,000 people this year already via these settlement routes. And if we don't tackle the illegal immigration, we can't afford to be so generous with the schemes where people are fleeing war-torn countries.
Edward, what are the good burgers of the cities of London and Westminster telling you?
The particular issue here is actually that I get a lot, and we have door knocking pretty much every day. And if I'm shivering, it's 'cause I've just come in from door knocking.
Are you mad in mid-December?
Doors win wars.
You're stirring up apathy.
Politicians should be all the year round, not just election time. But I think the thing that I get a lot is a different sort of immigration, which is the legal but very dodgy immigration of the global plutocrats coming here and buying citizenship through these scandalous schemes where you invest £100,000 or £1 million and basically get a British passport, and then buying up property, which is often not lived in, and which turns central London into a kind of soulless playground for plutocrats, and really, really annoys people. And I think
don't have any of those in Southend.
No, but it's a you can laugh at it, but if you haven't if the house next door to is owned by an offshore company and you have no idea who the real owner is, and you see people swanking around these enormous noisy sports cars at all hours of the day and night, you feel this isn't really your home anymore, and that's far more alienating, I think, than these worries about the political asylum from the wretched of the earth.
Right, we will move on to a different subject in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Just in case you've forgotten who our panel are tonight, we have Conservative MP Anna Firth, James Murray from Labour, Stanley Johnson and Edward Lucas, columnist for The Times and a Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate. Right, next question is a text question from Jenna in West Hampstead. Has anything really changed for women's safety since the murder of Sarah Everard? Now, of course, this is on the day that Jordan McSweeney was jailed for at least 38 years for the murder of Zara Alina in Ilford in June of this year. Of course, Sarah was murdered in March 2021. And I'm going to come to you first because women's safety is something that I think it has really crept up all agendas, not just political agendas, but I think it's something that the media take a lot more seriously than maybe it used to. Has anything changed in this area, do you think?
It's certainly changed in terms of prosecution rates for sexual offences, and I wish I had them all on the top of my head, but prosecution rates are definitely up, which I think is a positive thing. It's definitely changed in terms of being on the government's agenda. This is something which is regularly discussed, and there's lots of questions about this issue now in the House of Commons. Every time the Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, comes to the House, this is always a big topic. So awareness is massively increased. And as a female MP myself, it's certainly something which I prioritise. And it may just be a very, very small thing, but things like lighting are actually really important. Southend, coastal community, quite a few paths, cinder paths alongside the coast and footbridges over the railway. And it's amazing how many women will come up to me and say, the lights are not working, it's not adequately lit, and I take that really seriously.
Is that the job of an MP? Isn't that something for the local council? Well,
I take it very seriously to nag my local council to get it fixed.
James?
Yeah, actually, I was just about to say when I was thinking about the question what my local council is doing, because I think it is on the agenda for politicians and for the media. It's on the agenda for politicians and government at different levels. It's not just a national debate we have in Westminster. It is one where I think councils play a really important role, not just in working with the police and all the other agencies, but also in those really practical issues around making the public environment safer, better lighting, and so on. I think it is a bigger issue. Well, it's an issue which is talked about more than it was a few years ago. I think it's one that has higher profile than it did a few years ago. Any progress obviously is welcome, but I don't have the statistics. I don't get the feeling that people have full confidence in the level of prosecutions for violent crimes against women and girls. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but that is the feeling that I get from talking to colleagues of mine.
And Stanley Johnson, this is not just a women's issue, is it? It's the men who are perpetrating the violence against women and girls, and there's got to be, I would have thought, a much bigger emphasis on education here.
No, I'm sure you're right. Actually, just seeing Anna there reminds me that, of course, Anna comes from David Amos's constituency, and I was very heavily involved with David on all sorts of animal welfare issues. So, of course, he also had a bit of random violence, which was absolutely tragic. Yes, you have a very good point, actually. When I listened today to the proceedings in the court which are going on, it was shocking to me that this man, who has now been found guilty and sentenced, I think, for 38 years in jail, he wouldn't even come to the to hear the verdict. It made me feel really, really sad about this. And yes, it is, of course, absolutely for men to. I don't know where it all comes from. It's very, very hard to say. I mean, that story was just so awful. She went into a supermarket trying to get, and he was waiting for her outside. Anyway, sorry, it's difficult to go on talking. One's almost speechless.
Edward?
Well, first of all, half the population is in a state of mild fear whenever they leave their homes, and sometimes even when they're in their homes, and that should be a much bigger issue than it is. There's clearly some deep social things going on, and this whole incel culture, which is particularly prevalent in America, but I think is coming over here. Of sort of
incel. What does that mean? Incel?
Involuntary celibate. It's misogyny raised to a level of a sort of cult. But I think the first thing to say is it really is the criminal justice system isn't working, and one of the reasons it's not working is that it's been starved of funds, and for systematically over the last 12 years, so that the Crown Prosecution Service is operating on sort of one cylinder, and the courts don't work, and if you do manage to report a crime, the chances of the police actually catching the criminal and then bringing it to a court and the case actually ending in prosecution are very low. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is also that the police spend a huge amount of time dealing with completely pointless drug crime, and if we legalised cannabis and other soft drugs, that would immediately free up the police for other stuff. And I always think there's a kind of wetness about the police which really shocks me. Just literally 5 minutes from here, there's a large council estate. I went for a walk and talk with the local police constable, who was a very admirable person. And I said, "Where do you live?" And he said, I live in Kent. And I said, "Well, why don't you live here?" And he said, "It's not safe." I thought, how would you feel if you went to a restaurant where the waiters wouldn't eat the food? And it's astonishing to me that there are 3 police constables literally in this area here where we're sitting, and 2 PCSOs, and not one of them lives in the place.
Well, that's partly because they probably can't afford to.
No, I asked about that. I said I would campaign for Peabody and the other housing associations and Westminster Council to provide some police housing. That wouldn't be difficult. They said, no, we won't do that.
I mean, that is profound. I mean, I know this. I used to live just up the road from here, and I mean, of all the areas in London, you wouldn't regard this one where we're currently in as one of the most
Churchill Gardens estate
exactly.
is quite and it feels quite scary going around there at night. And drug crime and gang crime has gone up a lot because there's only one gang unit, and it's been taken off to North Westminster because they've had some stabbings and shootings up there, and the result is that this place is pretty much run by the criminals, and people are scared to report crime because they don't know what happened, and they're scared to be witnesses. And if you listen to that wonderful podcast on Protect Adam, this is a guy who witnessed drug crime, and he implored the police to protect him, and he was actually murdered when the criminals came out of prison. The first thing they did was to murder him because he'd been a witness.
Yeah, but I do think that we need to recognise how far we've come. I mean, I used to be a barrister, and when I was in practice initially, many years ago, it was very, very difficult to get a prosecution for rape.
But it still is.
Yes, it still is, but it used to be the case that you could only bring that prosecution if the woman's word was corroborated. Now that has changed enormously, which shows a change in attitude. Added to that, this government's had a really strong emphasis on crime against women. You know, we've had the upskirting bill, we've tackled revenge porn, we've had the online safety bill last week, and there's also been a big focus on domestic abuse. And we've got a female Home Secretary, we've got a female Attorney General, and it was at Attorney General's questions, actually, which I think was last week, where these points about the prosecution rates were really examined. And almost every region in the whole of the United Kingdom, those prosecution rates have gone up.
But going up from sort of 1% to 2% isn't a massive achievement. I mean, you can say, well, it's a 100% increase, but it's still a fraction.
The focus on this has really upped, and those, as I say, next time, and it will be too late because I'll have the figures and we won't get the question, but they were very significant.
Why not give a pay rise to the prosecution barristers?
We have.
No, you give the defence barristers got one, but not the prosecution ones.
That's true.
Thank you.
But those negotiations, there will be ongoing negotiations.
Barristers are leaving the profession in droves because they are earning less than they'd earn stacking shelves in Tesco's. And you've broken the criminal justice system by starving it systematically for years, and now we're surprised it's not working.
Well, believe it or not, I did a speech at the Tunbridge Wells Law Society annual dinner a few weeks ago. It was a very good evening. It was more like a Tunbridge Wells Rugby Club dinner, it turned out in the end. But this was a big topic of conversation, the fact that even if we can survive the next few years with people leaving, there are no younger barristers coming into the criminal prosecution profession, and that we're storing up a lot of trouble for ourselves. I mean, you must recognise that being a former barrister.
Yes, and on this point, I do agree with what you're saying, Edward. The 15% a pay deal for defence barristers. Obviously, it's over several years,
not backdated,
and it's the first one they've had for many years. But clearly, we have got to look at the CPS as well.
Well, if you're a new government, that would be fine. But this is a problem you've been sitting on for 15 years. The criminal justice system wasn't in great shape under Labour, I have to say. Even then, Charlie Faulkner, your former Tony Blair's best friend, gave a speech saying how most crimes are not reported. The crimes are reported. The police don't do anything. When the police do anything, it doesn't lead to a prosecution. When it leads to a prosecution, it doesn't lead to a conviction. So even then, it was like playing pinball. And it's got hugely worse since then. It's the single most important duty of government after national defence.
Which is why I mentioned right at the very beginning, when we talk about criminal gangs and people smuggling, that the prosecution rate has gone up by 250%. So,
which means by two and a half times. Actually, it's not 200.
Well, I think we should be celebrating the good things that the CPS are doing as well. But clearly, remuneration is an issue.
Right, we've got two cracking questions coming up, so don't go anywhere. It's 8:30 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has the news headlines.
A 6-year-old boy who was rescued from a frozen lake near Solihull has died. He'd been in intensive care since Sunday. 3 other boys, aged 11, 10 and 8, also lost their lives. A judge who's given a man a life sentence for murdering a woman in East London says he has no spine whatsoever. Jordan McSweeney, who's 29, killed law graduate Zara Alina in Ilford in June. And people on Shetland have been told they could be without electricity until the end of the week. Nearly 3,000 homes have been cut off since Monday following heavy snow which brought down power lines. LBC weather, wintry showers for northern Scotland and Northern Ireland overnight. Dry elsewhere with lows of -7.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Anna Firth, James Murray, Stanley Johnson and Edward Lucas answering the questions tonight. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Let's go to Ulf in Hamburg. Ulf, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Good evening, Ian. I cannot explain why the German government is not giving Ukraine battle tanks like Leopard 2 and Leopard 1. Can anybody on the panel explain to me why the British government isn't doing this either?
Edward, let's come to you.
We always put these red lines about what we can do, and then after a bit, we realise another 1,000 Ukrainians have died, and it's all got a bit worse, and then we decide we can do it after all. So everything we've done since the beginning is too little and too late. And if we'd done 1/10 of what we're doing now, back in January, we wouldn't have had what we've got, which is more than 100,000 people dead, millions maimed and traumatised and homeless, and $1 trillion bill for damages to reconstruct it. I think the problem with tanks is the supply chain logistics are tricky, and you've got to train people to do them. But the Ukrainians have shown amazing ability to learn how to use modern weapons. They've confounded expectations entirely on the positive side in their ability, both their determination to fight and their ingenuity and the speed with which they learn things. And I'm afraid that it's still the case that the West's response is too little and too late. And there's a stunning absence of contrition from any of our decision makers for the fact that they ignored warnings for 30 years about what was going wrong. And even now they're very, very slow to pick up and do what they need to do.
Do you think the mistake was right at the beginning? I can remember interviewing lots of people saying, well, of course, if we supply all of these things, it's going to antagonise Putin even more and potentially escalate the whole scenario. Well, there comes a point where you surely have to recognise that it's about as bad as it's going to get, and there's, apart from sort of pressing nuclear buttons, there is very little that could now antagonise Putin. He's already antagonised anyway.
Well, I wish you were Foreign Secretary.
Well, so do I.
but seriously, it's been a huge failure from the beginning, and I think that the Ukrainians have really shown, not just on the military front, but also on the sort of values front. They really believe in democracy. They're dying for the sort of values that we sometimes take rather for granted.
But it's a failure on the political front, but it's also a failure, I think, on the commentariat front.
I didn't think
just hang on a second, Stanley. Let me make this point. I can remember interviewing commentator, defence expert, security expert after security expert in the months leading up to the invasion. And they were all saying, no, of course Putin's not going to invade, blah, blah, blah. And they were all completely wrong. It's not just the politicians that got this wrong. I think you were possibly a notable exception.
Actually, no, I thought it was a menacing bluff. I told our government on the night before the invasion that they didn't understand Russia properly. So I was wrong on that. But I do think that there was plenty of warning, and we all believed that Russia was going to do something. I didn't think they were going to do this completely stupid, and I would say that in the end I was right and Putin was wrong. Putin's thing was as disastrous as I thought it was going to be. But we could have foreseen this. We were warned. The war started in 2014, and we've been so slow.
Exactly. Right, Stanley, you're going to get in.
I do. I want to stand up for a former Prime Minister on this point, if I may.
Which one?
Well, Liz Truss does need some support.
No, well, I'm talking about one with whom I have quite a close relationship. And honestly, I think it must be indisputable that this country did take a very firm and positive line.
Not on Russian dirty money.
Take a very firm and positive line on the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and I think we were probably ahead of the game. Certainly, that's what Mr. Zelensky seems to think. So, to that extent, I think the kind of criticism which I'm hearing around the table today is not fair. Now, on the particular point of tanks, that's something which the experts will rely on. But in the generality, I think we have taken a firm line, and I think we're going to do so.
Stanley, name one thing that Boris Johnson's government did to deal with Russian dirty money. They absolutely.
We're talking. This question was about Putin and the war.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's a valid point to make, but I don't want to get sidetracked. Let's stick. But do you think that if Boris Johnson had still been Prime Minister, Britain would be sending tanks to Ukraine in the way that the Ukrainians want?
Tanks, but no tanks. I think that he would rely on the advice of the Defence Secretary as to how plausible this is at this moment. I wouldn't like to really give a firm view on this one.
But we also have very few tanks because the government systematically wound down our armoured capability on the ground. It was old-fashioned and not needed. So we barely have enough tanks to defend ourselves, let alone to give to anybody
And
else.
that's a question we're going to return to for our 9 o'clock phone-in, just to get that in. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with Edward completely. I remember very, very clearly...
Stop clicking your pen.
Thank you. I remember very, very clearly having only just been elected to Parliament, the debates about the economic crime bill and the sanctions that we were slapping on the Russian oligarchs, and which we did on the owner of the Chelsea Football Club. So to say we took no action on Russian dirty money is absolutely wrong, and I think Stanley's absolutely right. We certainly led the European response to the Ukraine war under Boris Johnson, if not the world response. And it was a really salutary moment as a new MP to be addressed in the House of Commons by President Zelensky. I think it's one of the very first addresses that had ever happened. Yeah. And being so new, I'd queued up to get my earphones so I could actually hear it, as opposed to pretending I was hearing it. And the reason he addressed our Parliament was because the Ukrainians are very grateful indeed for the support that the UK...
But should we be sending them tanks? That's what they want us to do.
Well, I think we did the right thing by training their troops. What the support we want to give has got to be sustainable and effective. And we've given more weapons than any other country, other, of course, than the USA. And I think that, I mean, this is, above my pay grade. I think Ben Wallace is an excellent defence secretary. And if he judges that tanks is not the right thing to do, I would go along with that.
OK, James?
I mean, our support for Ukrainian people from the point of view of the opposition has been absolutely unflinching. And we recognise that the Ukrainian people need our support militarily, also economically, in terms of the humanitarian impact of what's happening, across the board. They need our support. Now, in terms of the specific question about what we supply to the Ukrainian people, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the tanks we're discussing, but I do know that there is a general principle about making sure that we are giving the Ukrainian people as much support as we possibly can without making the UK an actor in the war directly and then bringing in NATO and so on. So it's defensive support. It's as much support as we can give the people of Ukraine without crossing that line. And that has over the months led to some slightly difficult conversations. Where President Zelensky has asked for something and there's had to be a decision.
Well, it's led to some very difficult conversations between President Zelensky and Olaf Scholz and President Macron, who, they are providing military hardware now in a way that they weren't at the beginning of the conflict. But let's bring Ulf back into the conversation. Ulf, what's your explanation?
First of all, I noticed that nobody has really answered the question. You just danced around it, almost like some German politicians. And my explanation, I think Olaf Scholz is getting some resistance from some members of the Social Democrats. The FDP and the Green Party will be all in favor. And frankly, he has shown a certain weakness in decision-making all this time, not just in Ukraine. He dillies and procrastinates, and then he makes a solitary decision, and then he starts procrastinating again. So it's his weakness and probably some Social Democrats interfering.
Well, I think, Edward, you probably agree with that. You've been very critical of Olaf Scholz throughout this
Yes, I think Germany's policy for 30 years has been a mixture of sanctimonious greed, where they've done enormously lucrative deals with Russia, particularly on energy, while preaching to the rest of the world that they are champions of European values, and that's come profoundly unstuck. And these two scandalous pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, now out of operation, not before time. And it's quite right to criticise Scholz and also Macron for his extraordinary vanity and grandstanding. It's worth remembering that the only country that really matters actually is the United States. The United States has given more than all the other countries put together, and we may pride ourselves on doing what we've done, and that's fine, but it's tiny. But I do just want to say that on Russia, which is, it all starts with Russia, I was the first witness to the Intelligence and Security Committee inquiry into Russia, and I told them everything I knew. Boris Johnson tried to squash that report because it was embarrassing for the Conservative Party. He made sure it didn't come out before the 2019 election, and then he tried to change the committee so that it would never come out. And I think that's an enormous stain on his record, regardless of what he's done on the military side to support Ukraine.
Stanley, don't rise to it. Let's bring. Oh, thank you. Let's bring in a sort of allied question here with Christoph in Wembley Park. Hello, Christoph.
Hello there. Yes, I'd like the panel to tell me which they think might have given Vladimir Putin the greater cause for satisfaction. Tomorrow's nurses' strike, as suggested by Mr. Zahawi, or the departure not so long ago from the European Union of one of its most influential and important members.
Right. James Murray.
Well, I mean, I think the comment that Nadine Zahawi made about nurses and it was shameful. it was a ridiculous thing to say.
Let's quote his words accurately. He said, "This is a time to come together and to send a very clear message to Mr. Putin that we're not going to be divided in this way."
His implication was pretty clear what he was saying. I mean, I don't think it was acceptable comments for him to make. I don't know if he went off script and said that in a way that his bosses weren't very happy with, but I don't think it was the right thing for him to say. It is absolutely right that we should remain united, and I think we have done politically, and in terms of public opinion, in terms of the support for the Ukrainian people. And I think there was an interesting part of this discussion we were having, if I can just very briefly touch on it, about this economic crime and about transparency and about the ownership by those linked to Putin of a lot of property right around here. In fact, I'm sure on our ways home tonight we'll walk past many such properties which are owned in such a way. And there has been some movement since Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in terms of bringing forward the transparency. But it took that illegal invasion to get progress on it,
and it's still not.
And it's still not enough. And that should have been in place a long time ago. And so many of us have been pushing the government for so long on this.
I'm going to ask for some brief answers on this one because we're running behind time. Stanley, you voted Remain, unlike your son, who was the prime motivator to get us out of the EU. Do you think, had we known what was going to happen with regard to Putin and Ukraine, do you think that might have given Boris and maybe some others of us time to reconsider?
In terms of the question, would Putin be pleased that the UK has left the EU? Yes, I think it's absolutely the case. I remember actually met Putin in Russia in St. Petersburg in 2010 when I was there for the UN on a meeting, and he was in a very grumpy mood, and the British ambassador explained to me that Putin was increasingly worried about the EU pushing for Ukraine to become a member of NATO and Georgia and so on and so forth. And to that extent, I read a novel which envisaged that actually Putin suggested to Cameron that he put some words in the Bloomberg speech saying, yes, we'll seek to get out. So yes, I think it's been a big goal of policy for Putin, leaving aside the fictional part, that he has managed to get Britain out of the EU. I think it's a consequence which we should have foreseen, and we didn't foresee. And who knows? I think we need to rebuild that bridge. So that's my answer to that.
And you disgracefully didn't even mention the name of your novel, Compromat.
Compromat, well, there it is. I mean, it was indeed. I have in the novel, I have Putin not only getting Britain out of Europe, but getting Trump into power in America, if you remember, happened 5 months later.
Edward?
Well, I think it wasn't sufficiently appreciated during the Brexit referendum that the EU is a very important economic security organisation, as well as being all the other things. But I think one of the great things about this country is that we are able to disagree and protest publicly and do things like go on strike. And just try going on strike in Russia and see what happens to you. So I thought it was a completely perverse remark. I want us to be a country where you have the freedom to organise and to protest and do things that the government doesn't like and not end up with your head cracked in jail or worse.
Anna?
Well, if Putin was in Southend, the wonderful new city of Southend, neither would give him satisfaction because none of the nurses in Southend are going on strike, none of our ambulance staff are going on strike, and neither are our mental health services either. So I do want to give a shout out for the brilliant NHS
What about
staff.
Nadine Zahawi's comments, though? They were crass, weren't they?
Well, I think what he was trying to say is that it's always better if we can remain united. But united we stand,
a crass way to say it.
Divided we fall. Well, I mean, I wasn't at the event or where he said that, so I don't know the context in which he was speaking. But I think that was probably the general gist. But I think the other important point, if Putin was in Southend, there's no doubt in Southend that people voted to leave the European Union and will be proud of the actions that the UK have made in standing up to him and Ukraine. And we probably have played more of a leading role than we would have been able to if we'd stayed inside.
You see, you are the true inheritor of David Amos, because you've mentioned Southend in every single answer that you've given, and very well done for doing so.
And you made it clear it was a city.
Well, indeed. Right, we will take some more questions in just a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49 on LBC. Anna Firth, James Murray, Stanley Johnson and Edward Lucas with us. Anna just said to me, are these genuine questions? Do you not filter them? I said, no, they are genuine people who phone in. We haven't set them up at all. Right, let's go to Lois in Westcliff-on-Sea. Is that part of,
Absolutely.
That's part of your constituency, isn't it? Lois.
Anna is my MP. Hello, Anna Firth.
Well, there you go.
Hello,
so
Lois.
are you going to bowl her a softball then?
Actually, this is a question predominantly for Stanley Johnson, but I am interested in what the rest of the panel has to say, obviously, as well. In light of some of his recent comments on another channel, does he expect British people to fly and drive less, or in fact not at all, or eat less meat or no meat to save the planet and to fight global warming? I must say, I'm not seeing a tremendous amount of evidence for global warming at the moment. And also, just another thing, in terms of the renewable dream that he pushes constantly, how's it going? Because my understanding is that there's no wind and that all the solar panels are currently covered in snow. So I just would wonder what Stanley thought about that.
Go on.
Well, on the first point, it's perfectly obvious that we all are going to have to fly less, and we are all going to have to...
Where have you been in the last couple of months? You've been to China, you've been to Canada.
You bet. That's all
Shouldn't
true.
you lead by example?
It's all true. Well, I am planting a lot of trees down in Somerset.
There must be a hell of a lot of trees, I should imagine.
There's going to be a hell of a lot of trees. Now, but coming to the point, it's perfectly obvious that the government's getting together. They have to get together. They have to have programs. They will have programs, and those programs will include, bound to in the end, quantitative targets which different sectors can be allowed to emit. That is just inevitable, and that will include flying. It will also probably mean that we have to make comprehensive shifts away in terms of the kind of things that we eat, whether it's farm-fed, poultry with intensive feeding. But there's some systems which won't be so damaging to the environment. So yeah, the answer is it is going to happen. It's going to happen in the next 20 years in a big way. The change in consumption patterns is going to be forced on us by the need to deal with climate change and to deal with the loss of biodiversity, which is what I've been at in Montreal this week.
But the problem is there is a degree of hypocrisy, isn't there? And I remember at the COP26 conference, all these private jets landing at Glasgow Airport, and you think, and you're trying to lecture the rest of us on what we should do? you? It's outrageous.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. That, of course,
So you're doing the same. You're going to all of these conferences, flying there.
Fine.
And then lecturing the rest of us on it.
The time will come when the aviation sector knows that it's got a certain quota it can emit in terms of carbon emissions to the atmosphere, and it'll have to fit within that quota. That's going to happen.
So basically, poor people won't be able to go on holiday anymore. It's ordinary people that are going to have to suffer from this, because the rich will still be able to do it.
Not necessarily. Who can say? But all I can say is the reality is there will have to be real changes in consumption pattern and the way we live.
I'm kind of going to assume, Lois, that you must agree with your constituent.
Oh, of course. I think Lois's is the best question tonight.
Thank you.
No, thanks ever so much.
Do you really think global warming isn't happening?
No, I'm not saying that. Of course, I'm not saying that.
By the question.
No, I'm not saying that at all. Well, on your question, Lois. Yes, I think in principle, it's true that we are going to have to try and limit flying and driving, but obviously we can only do that, particularly where in Southend and Westcliff, Chalkwell and Leigh-on-Sea, if we've got an integrated transport network. And I for one are looking forward to the rail workers calling off this strike and stopping the disruption, which is really difficult.
Relevant to this question, to be fair.
Okay, but I still think it's quite important, because from Westcliff-on-Sea you do need to get the train to get up into London to go to work. I think we have made tremendous progress, particularly in the area, obviously, of coal and using coal to make energy. I mean, 40% of our energy supply when we came into power was from coal-burning power stations. That's now down to 1.8%, which is tremendous progress. But yes, I mean,
we've just opened a new coal mine.
Not a coal mine for generating energy. That is producing coking coal, which is the raw material for making steel.
Okay,
and we need steel. We need steel, though, Edward, to
and the
build.
Steel industry doesn't want
steel.
They're moving to hydrogen.
We need steel to build the offshore wind farms, which are powering our renewable energy.
Right. Let's not get off on a tangent onto coal mines, if we can, James.
I think there's a really important point behind Lois's question, which is about this transition, because we know that we've got to change our economy, our society. We've got to change so much about the way that we live because of the climate emergency that we're facing. And when I think about it, one of the tensions which has been in the discussion, I think, in years gone by, is people think, well, is there some tension or somehow contradiction between what we need to do to tackle climate change and economic growth? But actually, I think they go hand in hand, because what we've been setting out in the opposition is saying, look, we can invest in that green transition if we can invest in insulating properties across the country, invest in zero carbon power system, if we can invest in new electrical vehicle infrastructure and so on. That all tackles the climate emergency and provides economic growth. So I think, yes, there is going to need to be a big transition in our economy and our society, but it's something that we can do if we put our shoulders to the wheel and work with the private sector to deliver it.
Edward, quickly, if you can, because I want to get one more question in.
Well, we're starting 30 or 40 years too late, and that's why it's going to be immensely painful, and the biggest burden is going to fall on the poorest people on the planet who didn't contribute to the problem, and that's an enormous shame and scandal.
Right, let's move on to David in Sheffield. David, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hello, thank you for taking my call. It's a quick one. Is it about time that instead of constantly having a review to increase the pension age, the MPs started thinking, it's about time we reduced it to 60 for everybody? And supplement to that, I'd love some of these MPs who are making the decisions spend a couple of months doing some of the physical manual jobs ordinary people have to do, and then see if they could work to 68 doing that job.
Well, the government have calculated that reducing the pension age to 60 would cost £251 billion, so I suspect it's not going to happen. Quick answers from all four of you. James Murray.
I mean,
a great vote winner, though, wouldn't it?
I think as a shadow Treasury minister, I would not be that by the time I walked out the studio if I committed to something of that order. But there is an important point there about different jobs, and particularly if you've got a job which is very physically intensive and what impact that has on your retirement age. And I think the whole system should be conscious of that.
Anna?
Yeah. No, I don't think we should reduce the retirement age, David, except for professions where where firemen, perhaps nurses who've done a lot of lifting, where it's really difficult. Because actually, it's a massive success that we've now 1 in 3 girls born today are going to live to 100. We're living longer, and I for one actually don't mind working. I think working is brilliant occupational therapy. I think it's interesting. I enjoy making a contribution, and I enjoy representing Southend.
Oh, I was just waiting for you to get that word in there somewhere. And having just turned 60, I have no interest in this question at all. Edward?
I think that it's easy to pander to the voters who vote most often, but actually the truth is it's the youngsters who get the raw end of the stick. And if we've got any spare cash, it's generational justice. We, people of our generation, were paid to go to university. We bought cheap houses. We walked into good jobs, which mostly have excellent pensions if you're lucky enough to have a middle-class job. And people in their 20s don't have any of that. They face precarious jobs. They can't afford to buy anywhere to live. They have student debts, and that is a glaring injustice which threatens the whole cohesion of our society.
Stanley, the word retirement doesn't really pass your lips, does it?
No, I'm 82, and I must say I'm looking forward to a well-earned pension.
Just by the way, France have beaten Morocco 2-0, so we have the British nightmare final, France versus Argentina. Edward, who do you want to win?
France.
You have to say France.
As a new Frenchman, I want France.
You've just got a French passport.
Well, my grandmother played tennis for France at Wimbledon, and sometimes that's all filtered down to me.
Anna?
My son was born in France, so I think on that basis I'll say France.
James?
I think, didn't Macron tweet something quite nice about us? So I should say France to be magnanimous.
You all want France. I'm going to say Argentina, just because I want Lionel Messi to win the World Cup medal, to see the look on that Ronaldo's face, because I'm horrible like that. Right, final question from Alexa. Donald in Pendle says, who would the panel like to kiss under the mistletoe this Christmas? I'm not sure I want to hear these answers. Anna?
I'm going to be really boring. As an MP, I hardly ever see my husband, so I'm going to say my husband.
James?
My husband.
This is going to be very boring, isn't it? Edward?
In real life, my wife, but I was allowed fictional characters. I could go on some. I could.
Oh, no, feel free.
But I'm obsessed with George Eliot's characters. I'm not sure I'd actually want to kiss them, but I'd like to take Dorothea out to dinner and tell her not to marry Casabon in Middlemarch.
No idea what you're talking about. Stanley?
My younger daughter has just got, of course, a lovely kiss her, but she's just got a lovely collie puppy, and I think I would like to kiss that puppy under the
I totally relate to that. Now, I'm going to thank all of you for coming on the programme tonight. Thanks to all of our guests on Cross Question over the last 12 months. We've had some fantastic debates. I hope you'll be rejoining us when we have our first Cross Question of the new year, which I think will be on Tuesday the 3rd of January, but I might have to check that. In the next hour, we're going to talk about the fact that the Chief of the General Staff has issued a stark warning about the state of the British Army. I'm sure you'll have views on that. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, a 6-year-old boy has become the 4th youngster to die after falling into an ice-covered lake in the West Midlands. The child had been in a critical condition in